The first time I realized people had completely stopped caring about common sense. I was standing in the middle of a busy street at 6:30 on a Friday evening, watching a delivery truck block traffic while the driver leaned out his window and yelled, "Tell me that's not the car we're waiting on." Unfortunately, it was. A silver sedan sat directly in front of my loading dock under two bright yellow signs that literally said "No parking," and somewhere across the street, the owner was probably halfway through a basket of onion rings without a clue that he had just brought an entire shipment schedule to a halt. Looking back now, that's the moment this whole mess really started, though at the time I still thought people would eventually do the reasonable thing. I own a small distribution warehouse on the east side of Millhaven, an old manufacturing town that never completely recovered after most of the factories closed. My building used to store agricultural equipment decades ago, but when I bought it, I renovated the place and turned it into a supply distribution center. Nothing glamorous. We move products, load pallets, receive shipments, and try to keep customers happy. It's the kind of business nobody notices until something goes wrong. The building sits on a narrow commercial street squeezed between older brick warehouses and a handful of newer businesses that have slowly moved into the area. Along one side of the building is a paved loading lane that leads directly to our dock doors. That lane isn't decorative. It isn't extra parking. It's the only way freight trucks can safely back into the dock. Every day, trucks arrive carrying inventory worth thousands of dollars. Drivers need room to swing wide, line themselves up, and reverse into position. If that lane gets blocked, everything backs up. Drivers wait. Employees stand around. Customers get delayed. Money disappears. For nearly 7 years, none of that was a problem. Then a restaurant called the Copper Fork opened across the street. At first, I was actually happy about it. The neighborhood needed new business. The owner, a guy named Vince Parker, seemed friendly enough. During their grand opening week, my crew even ordered lunch from there a couple of times. The food was good. The place was packed. Everybody seemed to win. For about 2 weeks. Then reality showed up. The restaurant became wildly popular almost overnight. Every evening, their parking lot filled up. Every nearby curb space disappeared, and eventually customers started looking for alternatives. Apparently, my loading lane looked like a perfect solution. The first few incidents felt harmless. One car here, one car there. Someone would park, run inside for dinner, then leave 20 minutes later. Annoying, sure, but not enough to start a war over. Then the pattern got worse. Every day, another vehicle appeared. Pickup trucks, SUVs, sedans. It didn't seem to matter that the signs were impossible to miss. It didn't matter that the entire curb was painted bright yellow. People would pull in, glance at the warnings, shrug, and walk away like the rules existed for someone else. One afternoon, my receiving manager, Carla, walked into my office carrying a clipboard and said, "You know what the problem is?" I asked what. She said, "Nobody thinks they're the problem. Every person believes they're just one car for 5 minutes." She wasn't wrong. The trouble is that one car for 5 minutes becomes 10 cars for 30 minutes when everyone thinks exactly the same way. A few days later, one of our regular freight drivers named Eddie sat in traffic waiting for a blocked lane so long that he missed another scheduled delivery across town. When he finally got inside the warehouse, he threw his paperwork on a pallet and said, "Man, if somebody parked in front of my driveway every day, I'd lose my mind." I laughed at the time, but honestly, I was already getting there. What frustrated me most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the entitlement. Every single person parking there made a conscious decision. They saw the signs. They understood the signs. Then they decided their dinner reservation was somehow more important than everyone else's job. Still, I tried handling it the civilized way. One evening I walked across the street and introduced myself to Vince. I explained the situation calmly. I wasn't angry. I wasn't making threats. I just wanted help. Vince listened, nodded, and said, "I get it. I'll remind customers not to park there." For a moment, I thought that would solve everything. Maybe people simply didn't realize what they were doing. Maybe a few reminders would fix the issue. And strangely enough, for about 2 days, it actually worked. The loading lane stayed clear. Deliveries ran smoothly. My stress level dropped. Then Friday arrived. And with it came something that would completely change how I handled the problem from that point forward. That Friday started like any other busy evening, but by sunset I knew the situation had crossed a line I couldn't ignore anymore. Around 6 o'clock, one of our largest deliveries of the week arrived. A full trailer carrying inventory that had already been delayed by weather earlier in the week. The driver called me before he even turned onto our street. "Please tell me you've got room back there," he said. I remember laughing and telling him he should be fine. 10 minutes later, he called back again. Except this time, he wasn't laughing. I stepped outside and immediately saw the problem. For vehicles. Not one. Not two. For separate customer vehicles were lined up along the loading lane like they owned the place. A black SUV sat closest to the dock. Behind it was a white crossover. Then a pickup truck. Then a compact sedan. Together, they completely blocked the entire approach to the warehouse. The freight truck couldn't even begin lining up for the dock. Traffic was backing up behind him. Drivers were honking. My crew stood near the warehouse entrance staring at the scene like they were watching a slow-motion train wreck. Eddie climbed down from his cab and looked at me. "You still planning to be nice about this?" he asked. I didn't answer, mostly because I wasn't sure anymore. What made it worse was that every single one of those vehicles belonged to people eating at the Copper Fork. We knew because several employees watched them park and walk straight across the street. They didn't sneak in. They didn't act confused. They parked under the signs and walked away. One woman even paused long enough to read the sign before continuing toward the restaurant. That image stuck with me. She read it, then ignored it. The driver of the black SUV finally returned almost 30 minutes later. I approached him while he unlocked his door. "Sir, this is a loading zone," I said. "You've been blocking commercial deliveries." He barely looked at me. "I was only inside for dinner," I said. "Your vehicle delayed a freight truck carrying thousands of dollars in inventory." He shrugged. Actually shrugged. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Well, it sounds like that's your problem." Then he drove away. I stood there staring after him while traffic slowly started moving again. My problem. That phrase bounced around my head all weekend. Because in a way, he was right. It was my problem. The city wasn't going to solve it. The restaurant wasn't going to solve it. The customers certainly weren't going to solve it. If I wanted it fixed, I was going to have to fix it myself. Monday morning, I started making phone calls. Not angry calls. Not revenge calls. Just practical calls. I wanted to understand exactly what my legal options were. After speaking with local officials and reviewing property records, I learned something important. The loading lane was entirely private property. It wasn't public parking. It wasn't city-owned space. It belonged to my business. More importantly, because the area was clearly marked and properly signed, unauthorized vehicles could legally be removed. The regulations were surprisingly straightforward. The signs already met local requirements. The painted curb met requirements. Documentation existed showing the lane's designated commercial use. In other words, everything had already been done correctly years earlier. Nobody had enforced it because nobody had needed to. Until now. That afternoon, I contacted a towing company called Apex Recovery Services. The owner, a guy named Greg, listened patiently while I explained everything. Halfway through my explanation, he interrupted and said, "Let me guess. Restaurant customers." I laughed. "That obvious?" He laughed too. "Happens all the time." Greg came out the next day to inspect the property. He walked the lane, examined the signs, reviewed the paperwork, and finally nodded. "You're covered," he said. "If somebody parks here without authorization, we'll tow them." I signed a standing authorization agreement before he left. Simple, legal, professional, no drama. At least that's what I thought. The very first test came sooner than expected. That same evening, around 7 o'clock, a small blue hatchback pulled into the loading lane. My crew happened to be unloading inventory inside the warehouse, and several employees watched the entire thing unfold. The driver stepped out, glanced directly at the sign, tilted his head as if considering it, then locked his doors and walked toward the restaurant. Carla looked at me. "Should I call?" she asked. I looked through the warehouse window for a few seconds. Then I nodded. Yep. 20 minutes later, a tow truck rolled quietly into the lane. No sirens. No confrontation. No dramatic speeches. Just business. The operator hooked the hatchback, secured it, completed his paperwork, and drove away. The whole process took less than 10 minutes. Then came the part none of us expected to witness firsthand. About 45 minutes later, the driver emerged from the restaurant carrying a takeout bag. He walked casually toward where his car had been parked. Then he stopped. The confusion on his face was almost immediate. He looked left, then right, then back toward the restaurant. Then he pressed his key fob several times. Nothing happened. He spun in a circle, pressed it again. Still nothing. One of my warehouse employees whispered, "Oh no." Another employee whispered back, "Oh yes." Eventually, the driver spotted the towing notice posted near the sign. I watched his shoulders drop from across the street. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. Judging by his body language, they weren't pleasant calls. The next morning, something unusual happened. Nobody parked there. Then another day passed. Still nobody. I started wondering whether the lesson had already spread. Apparently not. 3 days later, another vehicle showed up. Then another. Then another. Each one disappeared the same way. Quietly. Legally. Efficiently. By the end of the second week, stories had begun circulating around the neighborhood. People talked. Restaurant customers warned other customers. Local business owners heard about it. Delivery drivers definitely heard about it. One evening, I actually overheard 2 people standing across the street looking toward the loading lane. One pointed and said, "That's the place that tows everybody." The other immediately replied, "Then let's park somewhere else." Those might have been the most beautiful words I'd heard all month. Naturally, not everyone was happy. A few vehicle owners called the warehouse, demanding explanations. One accused me of targeting restaurant customers. Another insisted the signs weren't visible, despite the fact that they were literally standing beside one while making the complaint. One woman claimed the towing was unfair because she was only gone for 15 minutes. I politely reminded her that the freight truck she'd blocked had also been delayed for 15 minutes. She didn't appreciate the comparison. The most interesting reaction came from Vince, the restaurant owner. About 2 weeks after the towing program started, he walked into my office unexpectedly. He wasn't angry exactly, but he definitely wasn't pleased. He sat down across from my desk and said, "You're costing some of my customers a lot of money." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Actually, they're costing themselves a lot of money." He didn't respond immediately. Neither did I. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You know they're complaining." "I know," I said. "My drivers were complaining first." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then something surprising happened. Vince nodded. Slowly. Reluctantly. But honestly. "Fair point," he admitted. That conversation changed the entire dynamic between us. Because for the first time, somebody acknowledged what I'd been saying from the beginning. This wasn't about parking. It wasn't about punishment. It was about consequences. People had convinced themselves the loading dock existed for their convenience simply because nobody had stopped them before. Once consequences appeared, their behavior changed almost overnight. And what happened next proved exactly how powerful those consequences really were. Within another week, the transformation was almost unbelievable. If someone had visited the warehouse a month earlier and then returned after the towing program took effect, they probably would have thought they were looking at 2 different places. The loading lane stayed empty. Freight trucks moved in and out smoothly. Drivers backed into the dock without sitting in traffic. Every now and then a new customer unfamiliar with the area would still take the risk. Usually it happened on a busy weekend when the restaurant parking lot filled up and someone got impatient. The pattern never changed. They would spot the open space, convince themselves it would only be a few minutes, and head inside. Then a tow truck would arrive. Paperwork would be completed, and another expensive lesson would begin. Those incidents became rare enough that employees started treating them like sightings of a rare animal. Someone would notice a vehicle parked in the lane and quietly announce, "We've got one." Then everyone would go back to work knowing exactly how the story would end. The most satisfying moment came nearly 6 months after everything started. I was leaving the warehouse one evening when I noticed a family pull into the loading lane. The father parked, looked around, and started reaching for the door handle. Then his teenage daughter pointed at one of the signs. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw her gesture toward the loading dock. A few seconds later, the father nodded, restarted the vehicle, and drove away to find another parking space. That tiny moment stuck with me because it showed something important. The reputation of the lane had become stronger than the signs themselves. People weren't avoiding the area because they suddenly respected loading docks. They were avoiding it because they knew there would be consequences if they didn't. Some viewers might think towing every vehicle was excessive. Honestly, I understand that argument. There were moments early on when I wondered the same thing. Nobody enjoys costing strangers money. Nobody wakes up excited to have cars hauled away. But every alternative had already failed. Conversations failed. Warnings failed. Patience failed. Courtesy failed. At some point, allowing the behavior to continue would have meant accepting that my employees, my drivers, and my customers deserved to suffer the consequences of someone else's selfish decision. And that didn't seem fair either. Looking back now, I don't really see this story as being about parking at all. I think it's about boundaries. Whether it's a loading dock, a driveway, a business, or even a relationship, people tend to keep pushing until they find a limit. The moment they discover the limit is real, everything changes. My loading dock never became free parking again. Deliveries stayed on schedule. The warehouse kept growing. Vince's restaurant remained successful. In the end, both businesses survived just fine. The only people who lost were the ones who convinced themselves that a clearly marked rule somehow didn't apply to them. And honestly, that's the part one still think about. If you had been in my position, would you have started towing immediately, or would you have kept trying to give people more chances? Do you think the customers were treated fairly, or do you think I went too far protecting my business? Let me know in the comments because I've heard strong arguments from both sides. And even now, years later, people still debate whether I was defending my property or teaching an expensive lesson that should never have been necessary in the first place.